This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 4th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Having in a previous screencast already looked at the many causes and some events that led British subjects in the American colonies to rebel against King George III's tyranny, here we will focus on what the colonists then did about that, starting with King George III's extreme reaction to the rebellious Boston Tea Party, and how that led to those first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, but heard round the world, which ultimately led to, or at least significantly contributed to, our formal Declaration of Independence from England. In the course of the American Revolutionary War, some key figures emerged that helped the Patriots stay the course even when things looked really bad, through to the decisive victory at Saratoga, making it a turning point of the war, and then on to the final battle at Yorktown and the British surrender. Along the way, we will look at the leadership of General George Washington that inspired fierce loyalty among his troops, the fiery Patrick Henry and his passionate speeches for the revolutionary cause, and the brilliant General Benedict Arnold, who ultimately turned traitor. Finally, we will look briefly at the many, often unmentioned African American or black patriots and loyalists that fought on both sides of the conflict in segregated black regiments. One would think that as a father to 15 children, King George III would know that when a teenager rebels against your authority, it is often wise to resist the temptation to tighten the grip of your control. But I suppose since his first child was still just 12 at this time, it is understandable. When colonists in Boston rebelled against his Tea Act by dumping the tea in Boston Harbor, the King and Parliament had had enough of their upstart colonies and responded swiftly and harshly, intending to force or coerce the colonists into obeying their king. This punishment was in the form of a set of acts called the Coercive Acts by Parliament, but the colonists quickly began referring to them as the Intolerable Acts. The acts essentially shut down Boston Harbor, took away any and all local control of the town, giving it solely to a governor and his council appointed by the king, and made British officials immune to any form of colonial justice, and forced the colonists to pay for food and shelter of the British troops. And as that parent of a teenager could have told him, rather than forcing the colonists to fall into line, it only pushed them further towards rebellion. More British troops were brought in to subdue the colonists and quickly took control of Boston, but the countryside surrounding the city was another story. Patriots were organizing the farmers in the area around Boston into volunteer soldiers called Minutemen and stockpiling weapons in nearby Concord. When the British got wind of this, they determined to march there and confiscate or destroy the weapons, stopping first in Lexington to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock for their rebellious activities. The Minutemen were warned of this plan by a group of patriots, including Paul Revere, who rode out of Boston to warn them, an action made famous in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. The Minutemen met the British soldiers on the Green in Lexington, where the first shots of the American Revolution were exchanged. 7 Americans were killed in this initial conflict, and the British soldiers continued on to Concord without arresting Adams and Hancock. They were again met by the colonial militia in Concord, and while they were able to destroy some of the weapons, the militia chased them all the way back to Boston, firing upon them from the cover of bushes and trees. This first exchange of gunfire between the colonists and the British soldiers was poetically referred to as the shot heard round the world by Ralph Waldo Emerson because of its far-reaching repercussions. Now, after the Intolerable Acts, the colonists sent a representative from each of the 13 colonies except, I am sorry to say, Georgia, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to discuss this newest abuse of power by King George. Among them were John Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry, who would later give his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech at the Virginia Convention. At this first Continental Congress it was determined that they would send the king a petition listing their complaints and asking for the right for colonial approval of any new acts that Parliament might pass. They also agreed to meet again if the king did not comply. Well, the king basically ignored them, and so they met again at the Second Continental Congress. This meeting took place after Lexington and Concord, and as the Revolutionary War had already been going on for nearly a year, petitions were out of the question. It was time to declare our independence. The Declaration of Independence is exactly what its name suggests. It is the document that a core group of 5 of the delegates, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and of course Thomas Jefferson, were responsible for drafting, and the others adopted when they gathered in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that essentially explains why the colonists were separating from England. The other men on the drafting committee greatly respected Thomas Jefferson's way with words, and, to quote Jefferson, unanimously pressed him to write it. He then asked Franklin and Adams to review it, and finally on July 2, 1776, it was presented to the full Congress for adoption. Over the next 2 days the full Congress discussed and revised it, and it was officially adopted on July 4, 1776, and so that is the day celebrated as Independence Day in America. The oft-quoted eloquent preamble, with its compelling, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," was left untouched, however, and remained Jefferson's alone. The Declaration of Independence states many of the tenets that would become the basis upon which we would build the Constitution and the foundation of our government. The Declaration clearly and explicitly explains why the colonists felt this step was necessary. At the heart of it is that they believe that people create governments for the purpose of protecting their rights, and when governments cease to do this, people have the right to separate from that government and create one that does. Such they felt was the case with King George and Parliament, and it goes on to itemize instances where this was the case. So now, instead of fighting for their rights as British citizens, the colonists found themselves fighting for their independence. Knowing this, the Second Continental Congress also appointed George Washington, one of the delegates from Virginia, as the commander-in-chief of the now officially dubbed Continental Army. This, it turned out, was a very good choice, for the Continental Army was poorly armed, poorly supplied, and poorly trained. Yet Washington was able to hold them together and keep them fighting despite the horrible deprivations and hardships of the 8-year-long war. The early years of the war went relatively badly for the Continental Army, and the long cold winter at Valley Forge nearly did them in. But the troops stuck by Washington, and their loyalty paid off with the Battle of Saratoga, which would become a turning point for them. The British were invading from Canada and had been quite successful when a brilliant military strategist, General Benedict Arnold, talked the powers that be into allowing him to go on the offensive. He and his troops eventually surrounded the British, forcing their surrender. What makes this battle so noteworthy is that the colonial victory convinced a rather unlikely ally to join the American effort, the French, our former adversaries from the French and Indian War. Arnold, however, felt he never received the recognition he deserved. On top of that, he and his wife found themselves in debt, and so, angry with his superiors and hurting for personal funds, he accepted an offer from the British to turn over a major fort in New York, West Point, in exchange for money and recognition in England. His traitorous plan was discovered, however, and while he escaped capture and prosecution as a traitor, he was never really trusted by the British either, and his name would forever after come to be used to describe the ultimate traitor. With the help of France, the tide of war begins to turn in favor of the Continental Army. The last major battle of the American Revolution began when British General Charles Cornwallis and his army were attempting to build a deep-water harbor in Yorktown, Virginia. Washington decided to take advantage of this by leading the British to believe he would be attacking New York, when in reality he was combining forces with the Virginia Continental Army and heading south to Yorktown. With the help of the French Navy, who blockaded the port, preventing Cornwallis from escaping by sea or getting supplies or reinforcements, and Washington's army surrounding them, Cornwallis and the British army surrendered at Yorktown, ending the American Revolution. Despite the Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal, there were an estimated 5,000 African American or black men that fought to earn this country's independence that were not granted those rights. In fact, at first, they were not welcome in the Continental Army at all, despite their willingness to fight, for at this time every colony allowed slavery, and Congress was concerned arming slaves would be a bad idea. As the need for soldiers increased, they began to accept experienced free African Americans or blacks, and soon extended that to any free African American or black, regardless of experience. Eventually, as the war ground on, and as the need for soldiers grew, Congress authorized the enlistment of slaves as well as freemen, and even went so far as to offer Southern colonies $1,000 for every slave that enlisted, but the Southern colonies, with the exception of Maryland, still refused, and so the majority of African American or black soldiers came from the Northern colonies. One of the most recognized black regiments was the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. While commanded by white officers, this regiment was otherwise comprised entirely of African Americans or blacks. Among its other accomplishments, this regiment was there at the Battle of Yorktown and captured a key division of Cornwallis's. The British tried to use the practice of slavery against the Southern colonies by encouraging slaves to escape and join British regiments, and many did, but in the long run, this only provoked Southerners to support the patriotic cause, and though tens of thousands of slaves escaped their masters across British lines, less than 1,000 actually fought for the British. The loyalty of the African Americans or blacks who fought for the Patriots did not entirely go unrecognized or unrewarded. Many in the New England and Middle colonies recognized the hypocrisy of continuing to own slaves while fighting for independence and equality of all men, and so, in New England, following the British defeat at Yorktown, slavery was swiftly abolished, and the Middle colonies followed suit a bit more gradually. And so the brave and heroic actions of these black regiments resulted in the first steps that would eventually lead to the emancipation of all slaves in America, and perhaps the promise of full equality for all men promised in the Declaration of Independence would one day become a reality. That's all we have time for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here now are some links to some helpful resources, as well as the works used in the creation of this screencast.